In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the motor in a Ridgid model 86008 cordless drill. We'll get started by removing the side housing on the drill. First I'll slide the battery off, and then I'll remove the series of screws. I'll remove this rear cover. One screw between the transmission and the housing, and then I can remove the housing. I'm also going to remove the screw between the transmission and the opposite housing. That way when we go to remove the motor, we can lift the transmission out of the housing slightly. Now I have access to the motor, the transmission, and the switch. First, I'll separate the motor from the transmission. I want to be careful as I do this so I don't pull the individual gears out of the transmission. This plastic plate is the end cap for the transmission, and it's pressed onto a bearing on the motor. So I need to separate that and remove it from the motor. I'll just carefully pry it away with a screwdriver. Now I'm going to clean all the dirt off this transmission end plate and install it back onto the transmission. I've got the end plate all cleaned up, so I'll install it back onto the transmission. Now we can turn our attention back to the motor. I'll lift the motor away from the housing and also lift the switch away from the housing. You'll notice that the motor connections are soldered to the switch. We'll need to desolder these connections. Before I begin desoldering these connections, I want to take note of the location of the wires, which side the black is on and which side the red is on. Also, whenever you do any soldering, be sure to wear safety glasses. A pair of needle nose pliers can be helpful to remove the wires. There's one side. Now I'll do the other. Now we can begin installing our new motor. First, we need to solder the wire connections back to the switch. And again, I made note of where each wire went before we desoldered it. So I'll place the proper color back on the proper side of the switch. Apply a little bit of paste flux to the connection. The flux cleans the metal and makes for a stronger bond. And now I'll heat that joint and apply some new solder. And now the same thing on the other side of the switch. With the wired connections made, now I'm just going to clean some of the dirt and grease out of the housings before we install the new motor. Now I can reinstall the switch and the new motor into the housings. Just want to take my time to line everything up and make sure that none of the wires are going to get pinched. I'll thread the wires through the housings. These wired connections at the bottom of the brush holder need to stay on the bottom of the housing. As I place the motor into the housing, you'll notice a flat on the top of the brush card, and that lines up with a slot in the housing. Also on the motor, you'll notice a couple of notches, and those go on either side and line up with a tab on the housing. Like that. There's a good chance when you took the transmission out of the housing, this little copper clip fell out. This clip indexes the clutch on your drill. It installs back into the housing with the notch up, and the top slides into the little groove on the housing. Now I can reassemble the transmission to the motor. First, I need to line up the gears. By turning the chuck a small amount, it'll rotate the gears in the transmission until they align with the motor gear. Once those are aligned, now I need to press the bearing back into the transmission housing. With the gears lined up and the bearing installed, now I just fit the transmission back into the lower housing. This is the reverse lever for the switch. It goes through the housing and over the post on the top of the switch. At this point, I'm going to reinstall the screw that secures the transmission to the opposite side of the housing. This clip is another piece that probably fell out when you took your drill apart. It's the clip that holds an extra driver bit at the back of your drill, and it just slides into the housing. And now I can go ahead and replace the side housing. Take your time to make sure you get everything aligned properly, and don't force it. If it seems to be hanging up on something, take it apart and make sure that you have all the wires lined up and all the tabs between the transmission and the housing are lining up. Once everything is aligned, go ahead and retighten the screws. Now the second screw between the transmission and the housing. And I'll finish up by replacing the rear cover.